Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto the private jet, expecting nothing less than pure luxury, plush leather seats, first-class service, and, for once, a moment of peace. After months of endless commitments, sponsorship deals, and charity events, this flight to the Maldives was supposed to be his well-earned escape. The dim cabin lights, the hum of the engines, the soft-spoken flight attendants, it all set the stage for a smooth, stress-free ride. As he settled into his seat, stretching out his long legs, a flight attendant approached with a freshly pressed glass of juice. "Here you go, Mr. O'Neal," she said warmly. Shaq grinned, lifting the glass in a playful toast. "Y'all really outdid yourselves with this setup," he said, his signature charisma on full display. He glanced around at the other passengers, business professionals, vacationers, people lost in their own worlds. No one seemed to recognize him, which was rare, but welcomed. Anonymity was a luxury even a private jet couldn't always guarantee. The engines roared to life, and as the city below faded into a blur, Shaquille finally allowed himself to relax. For the first time in a long while, life felt uncomplicated. Hours into the flight, the cabin dimmed for nighttime. Passengers settled in, some watching movies, others dozing off. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have successfully left U.S. airspace and are cruising at 35,000 feet. The weather is clear, and we're on schedule to arrive in the Maldives in just under 8 hours." Shaquille gave a small nod of appreciation. So far, so good. And then, it happened. The cockpit door swung open, and out stepped the captain. He was a tall man, late 40s, neatly combed hair, an air of authority about him. At first, his demeanor seemed friendly as he greeted a few passengers. But as he walked down the aisle, something felt off. His gaze was sharp. Too sharp. Then, he stopped. Right in front of Shaquille's seat. For a moment, there was silence. "Enjoying the flight, sir?" the captain asked, his tone polite, but with an undercurrent of something else. Shaq lowered his sunglasses, offering a nod. "Sure am. Y'all run a tight ship. Appreciate it." But the captain didn't move. His expression hardened. The air grew thick with tension. "Well," the captain said, his voice suddenly laced with suspicion, "we aim to ensure everyone here belongs. May I ask who you are and why you're on this flight?" Shaquille blinked. Was this guy serious? "I'm Shaquille O'Neal," he said, gesturing to himself. "Booked this flight fair and square. Everything's in order." The captain's frown deepened. "I see. But you'll forgive me if I don't just take your word for it." Nearby passengers started to take notice, their curious glances adding to the unease. Shaq's jaw tightened. He dealt with his fair share of doubters before, but this was different. This was blatant. "Look," he said evenly. "You've got the paperwork, right? Check it. Everything's legit. No need to make a thing out of this." But the captain didn't budge. Instead, he cast a glance around the cabin, as if seeking validation from the other passengers. Then, with a sharp turn, he disappeared back into the cockpit. Shaquille exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. Something about this didn't sit right. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Then, thud. The jarring impact of the landing gear hitting the ground snapped him out of his thoughts. This wasn't the Maldives. This wasn't where they were supposed to be. And whatever was happening next, Shaquille O'Neal wasn't ready for it. The roar of the engines faded. The sharp hiss of depressurization filled the cabin. Shaquille O'Neal sat up, rubbing his temple, still sore from where he'd been shoved against the cabin wall earlier. His body ached. His patience was wearing thin. Outside, thick humidity seeped into the aircraft, making the air heavy and suffocating. Something was wrong. The passengers murmured in confusion, their puzzled voices growing louder as they glanced out the windows. This wasn't the Maldives. Instead, the plane had landed on a desolate airstrip surrounded by dense greenery on all sides. Cracked pavement. No terminals. No signs of civilization. Then, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've made an unscheduled stop due to a passenger-related safety concern. We appreciate your patience as we resolve this matter." Shaquille's eyes narrowed. Passenger-related safety concern? He muttered the words under his breath, disbelief laced with anger. He knew exactly which passenger they were talking about. The cabin door opened with a loud hydraulic hiss. A ramp extended onto the uneven tarmac below. The heavy air swept into the plane, thick with the scent of damp earth. Then he saw him. The captain. His face was cold, void of emotion, like a man carrying out something he had planned long before this flight ever took off. Two flight attendants followed closely behind him, their faces tense, hesitant. They glanced at each other, then at Shaquille. Their unease was clear as day. Then the captain spoke. "You." His voice was sharp, commanding. His finger pointed directly at Shaquille, like he was calling out a criminal. "Get up. Get your things. You're getting off this plane." Silence filled the cabin. Shaquille raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "Man, you can't be serious. I paid for this flight just like everybody else here. I'm not going anywhere." The captain's jaw tightened. His lips curled into a sneer. "I said, get up. Now. Or I'll make you." The tension was thick. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked on with quiet sympathy, others kept their heads low, pretending they weren't witnessing what was happening. A voice barely above a whisper came from a man in a nearby seat. "Don't do it, big man. Don't give him a reason." But Shaquille wasn't looking for a reason. The captain stepped forward, deliberate and slow, the kind of movement that belonged to a man who thought he had power. "You think you're special?" the captain hissed, his voice dripping with unchecked arrogance. "You think money and fame let you walk into places you don't belong? Not on my flight. Not today." That was it. Shaquille stood. Slowly. Deliberately. His towering frame cast a shadow over the smaller captain. His eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "Listen, man," Shaquille said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a man who had nothing to prove. "I'm not your problem. You are your own problem. Get out of my face before you make it worse for yourself." But the captain was beyond reasoning. His pride was wounded, and his ego demanded retribution. Then, without warning, he shoved Shaquille. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Shaquille stumbled back, pressing a hand to his chest where the captain had shoved him. He exhaled slowly. Controlled. He clenched his fists, but didn't raise them. He knew exactly how this would play out. Headlines wouldn't read "Racist Captain Kicks Off Celebrity Passenger." They'd read "Aggressive Athlete Loses Control on Flight." The captain smirked, mistaking Shaquille's restraint for fear. "What's wrong, big man?" he mocked, voice filled with contempt. "Scared to fight back?" Then it escalated. The captain grabbed Shaquille's arm, yanking hard. Before he could react, one of the stewards moved behind him, locking his arms in a tight hold. Another shoved down on his shoulders, forcing him to bend forward. "What the hell are you doing?" Shaquille's voice rumbled like distant thunder. He tried to pull free, but the two smaller men tightened their grip, straining to control his 7-foot frame. Passengers gasped. Some pulled out their phones, cameras rolling. "That's enough, man," a man in a suit called out from his seat. "You're going too far." "Mind your business," the captain snapped without even looking back. "He's a threat to this flight. Threats don't get to stay on board." With one final yank, they dragged Shaquille toward the open door. His sheer size made it difficult, but with all three of them pulling, they forced him to the edge of the ramp. The captain sneered. "Watch your step." Then he shoved him. Shaquille fell. Hard. His back hit the rough concrete. A sharp, burning pain shot through him as gravel tore into his skin. Then, thud. His duffel bag landed squarely on his chest, knocking the wind out of him. Silence. Passengers stared from the open door. Some with horror. Some with indifference. Then came the final sound. The deep, metallic slam of the cabin door locking shut. The engines roared back to life. And before Shaquille could even sit up, the jet was gone, leaving him stranded. Alone. In the middle of nowhere. The captain leaned out from the aircraft door, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "Now you're exactly where you belong, O'Neal," he sneered. "Stay there." The ramp retracted. The door slammed shut. And then, the engines roared to life. Shaquille lay on the ground, staring up as the plane lifted off, its lights fading into the sky. Within seconds, it was gone. And he was alone. Thick jungles surrounded the desolate airstrip on all sides. The air was heavy, thick with humidity. Distant chirps of insects and unidentifiable animal calls echoed through the trees. The oppressive heat pressed down on him, sweat already trickling down his face. Slowly, he sat up, wincing as his back throbbed from the impact. Dirt and gravel clung to his arms. His shirt was torn at the sleeve. He looked around. No people. No cars. No airport staff. No signs of civilization. Just him. The jungle. And the silence. For a moment, pure anger surged through him like a tidal wave. He thought about all the times he'd been forced to keep his cool, to be the bigger man. This time, they had literally dragged him out. Tossed him like he was nothing. Discarded him like trash. Not this time. His jaw tightened. His fists clenched. He exhaled slowly, then picked up his duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and started walking. At the edge of the clearing, he spotted a small wooden shack, old, weather-beaten, barely standing. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. But it was his only option. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open. A man stood there, eyes narrowed in suspicion. His skin was dark, his clothes simple, but his gaze was sharp, watchful, like someone who had seen too much. "Who are you?" the man asked in a thick accent. Shaquille wiped sweat from his brow. "Just a man looking for some help." The man looked him up and down, his eyes lingering on the bruises on Shaquille's arms, the torn fabric of his shirt. His expression softened. "Come inside." The small room smelled of smoke and earth. Inside, a few locals sat around a fire, their eyes filled with curiosity. One of them, a younger man, stared at Shaquille for a long moment before his eyes widened with recognition. Wait. You're Shaquille O'Neal." The others turned, their eyes darting between the towering figure in front of them and the old TV flickering in the corner. Shaquille exhaled, still catching his breath. "Yeah. That's me." He shook his head. "Had a bad flight." The young man grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ain't no way they did you like that, man. Ain't no way." Shaquille dropped his duffel bag to the ground, wiped his hands on his pants. His eyes narrowed with resolve. "Oh, they did," he said, his voice steady as stone. "But they're gonna wish they didn't." Months later. The sun blazed down on the courthouse steps as reporters swarmed the entrance. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. The hum of murmuring voices swelled into a frenzy. Then, the black SUV pulled up. The doors opened. And out stepped Shaquille O'Neal. Dressed in a sleek black suit, his towering frame cast a long shadow over the pavement. His face was calm, but in his eyes, there was something deeper. The weight of everything he had endured. The exhaustion. The anger. And the unshakable determination. Reporters shouted over each other. "Shaq, Do you have a statement? Do you think you will win the case? Are you seeking financial damages or justice? Shaquille didn't answer. His gaze stayed locked on the courthouse doors. His manager, Kevin, raised a hand, signaling for silence. No comments right now, he announced firmly. We'll speak after the hearing. The cameras clicked. The world was watching. Inside the courthouse, the air was sharp, cool against his skin. Footsteps echoed in the grand marble hall. Police officers and legal clerks moved in controlled chaos. As Shaquille entered the courtroom, all eyes turned to him. The tension in the air was thick. The benches were packed with journalists, activists, and everyday citizens who had followed the case since the viral videos first surfaced. #JusticeForShaq had trended worldwide for weeks. And now, every eye in the country was watching. Across the room, at the defense table, Captain Richard Wallace sat stiffly in his chair. His suit, pressed, polished, was meant to give him an air of professionalism. But it didn't. Instead, he looked uncomfortable. His eyes flickered, nervous. His fingers tapped restlessly on the table. The once proud captain now looked like a man who had lost control of his own fate. Kevin leaned in, muttering under his breath. Look at him. Not so tough now, huh? Shaquille didn't take his eyes off Wallace. He thought he could treat me like that, he murmured. Because he thought nobody would care. He exhaled, slow. Now, the whole world's watching. Then, the doors swung open. The judge, an older woman with a stern expression, entered the courtroom. All rise, the bailiff announced. The room stood as one. The judge took her seat, adjusted her glasses. She surveyed the courtroom, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke. Be seated. And just like that, the battle for justice began. The judge's voice rang through the solemn courtroom, firm and unwavering. The court will now hear the case of O'Neal versus Wallace. Case number 473,926. A collective rustling filled the air, clothes shifting, feet adjusting, a whispered murmur rippling through the crowded benches as everyone settled into their seats. The tension was thick, pressing down like a heavy fog. The courtroom itself was grand, polished mahogany benches, tall windows that let in slants of afternoon light, and a massive emblem of justice hanging behind the judge's seat. The weight of history, of accountability, hung in the air. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may begin. All eyes turned to Amanda Reed. She didn't just stand, she rose. A powerhouse in the legal world, she was known for her razor-sharp mind, her meticulous precision, and her ability to take opponents apart, piece by piece. Her navy blue suit was as crisp as her tone. Her every movement was deliberate, controlled. She walked forward, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, stopping just before the jury. She let the silence breathe for a second. Then, she spoke. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear a story that, unfortunately, many of you may find familiar. Her voice was steady, powerful, a voice trained to command attention. A story of unchecked power. A story of bias. A story of a man who believed that his authority gave him the right to humiliate, assault, and abandon another human being as if he were nothing more than garbage. A ripple of unease passed through the room. She gestured toward Shaquille, the man they had all seen in the viral videos, but now flesh and blood before them. But today, that man learns that power does not protect you from accountability. Silence. The jury was locked in. She had them. Every eye in the room followed her as she walked, her presence commanding but never rushed, every step intentional. Captain Wallace didn't just remove Mr. O'Neal from that flight. He violated his rights. He assaulted him. And he left him stranded in a foreign jungle, no phone, no assistance, no concern for his well-being. Her voice was unwavering, but her words struck like a hammer. She let that moment sit. The evidence you will see today, the videos, the testimonies, the captain's own words, will make one thing clear. She turned, her gaze cutting through the tension in the room. Captain Wallace did not act as a man of authority. A pause. He acted as a man of prejudice. She let the weight of that statement settle. The gravity of it was undeniable. Then, she delivered the final blow. At the end of this trial, I will ask you to do what he never expected anyone to do. Hold him accountable. And with that, she returned to her seat. Eyes sharp. Expression unreadable. Then came the defense. Gregory Haynes stood, adjusted his tie, buttoned his suit jacket with shaky fingers. He tried to look confident. He wasn't. He exhaled, walked to the jury, tried to smile, but it wasn't convincing. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice carefully measured. I'm sure you all know who Shaquille O'Neal is. He forced a small chuckle, as if he were stating the obvious. Big. Famous. Beloved by millions. He paced slowly, hands clasped. But being famous doesn't make you above the rules. A flicker of movement, a glance at Wallace, as if searching for reassurance. My client, Captain Wallace, acted to protect the passengers on that flight, he continued, his tone gentle, almost pleading. You'll see that his actions, while perhaps misunderstood, were in accordance with safety protocols. A pause. A slow, forced smile. Safety isn't always comfortable. He tried to frame Captain Wallace as a professional, a man simply doing his job. But no one in that courtroom was buying it. Not after everything they had seen online. Not after that viral video of Wallace shoving Shaquille off the plane, playing on repeat in their minds. Not after his own words. Now you're exactly where you belong, O'Neal. The jury wasn't just watching this trial. They had already lived it. Then, the first witness was called. A flight attendant. Sarah Alvarez. She stepped to the stand, hands twisting nervously in her lap. After taking the oath, Amanda Reed approached her with a firm but reassuring demeanor. Miss Alvarez, you were on that flight, correct? Sarah swallowed. Nodded. Yes, she answered softly. You witnessed the incident between Captain Wallace and Mr. O'Neal? Another nod. Her eyes flickered toward Wallace. Amanda Reed didn't let her off the hook. Don't look at him. Look at me. A shaky breath. Then, Sarah began. Captain Wallace told us that Mr. O'Neal was a threat to the flight. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But he wasn't. He was just sitting there, minding his own business. Her hands trembled. I saw Captain Wallace grab him, twist his arm behind his back, and I heard him say. She hesitated, her voice breaking. He said, people like you think you can buy respect. A ripple went through the courtroom. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, took a breath. He shoved him. He shoved him so hard. I should have done something. But I was afraid. Her voice cracked. A tear slipped down her cheek. I didn't want to lose my job. Amanda Reed let the silence breathe. Then, she stepped closer. You did something now, Miss Alvarez. You told the truth. And just like that, the case shifted. Then came the final blow. The video footage, projected on the massive courtroom screen. And there was no denying it now. Wallace, grabbing Shaquille. Wallace, twisting his arm. Wallace, taunting him. Wallace, shoving him off the plane. And then, his own words. Now you're exactly where you belong, O'Neal. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The jury's eyes widened. At the defense table, Captain Wallace sat frozen, his face pale. His lawyer? Ghost white. It was over. Everyone in that room knew it. Amanda Reed faced the jury. This case is not just about Mr. O'Neal. It's about all of us. Every one of us who has ever been told we don't belong. Every one of us who has been made to feel small. Today, you have the power to remind the world that no one is above the law. Not even Captain Wallace. The verdict came in less than 3 hours. Guilty. On all counts. And justice? Finally served.